To this point, you have only, I believe, other than maybe a few early efforts into the Psalms, heard me teach New Testament. So by a recommendation of a student, we're going to go into the book of Esther. And one of the reasons why is, number one, it'll be shorter. All right, that's for you. So we'll be dealing with that, and it'll be a shorter study, but probably not as short as what someone else might do, I'll be honest. The other thing is looking into the Old Testament, and to give you a little bit of taste of that, and it is very different because it is a narrative. And in matter of fact, in many ways, I would say, in literary terms, it is the narrative. Despite what you have throughout all of the Old Testament in its history, and that's what we talk about, the narrative is that there is a storyline ongoing. When you start in Genesis, it begins a storyline. As you go through the Old Testament, you see a storyline of what God is, how God is working through individuals in the patriarchal age, how he is working with Israel as that comes on the scene, and his interaction back and forth with them, the good and the bad. And then you go through all of this effort to see how they rose and fell as God provided for them according to what he said, and then they failed to appreciate it and stand by it. Well, as you get down to Esther, we find it falls at the very end of this narrative portion of the Old Testament. Now, that does not mean it is last chronologically. Technically, Esther falls time frame-wise in the middle of Ezra. But there's a reason why I believe that it is given, number one, separately, and that it is tied to Ezra and Nehemiah. But one of the things I want you to see, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail probably next week, is that what we have with Esther that is different is that the way it is constructed and written, you have someone who I would argue, and we'll talk about the options in a moment, but is writing inspired history with a dramatic flair for storytelling to be remembered and probably regularly used orally. And you can tell that by the high level of storytelling that goes into this book, that it is framed so well that what we're going to do to illustrate this is I'm going to talk to you about some literary, very basic, don't get too worried, basic literary kind of aspects that we should consider when we're looking at narrative that I talk to the students about, and then how that benefits us understanding what's actually happening within the text. Now, the first place you really ought to begin any kind of study, and Esther also gives us a real challenge here, is it's what's called canonicity. That's why is it included in the Old Testament? And we just take that for granted. You say, well, what's in the Bible? Well, right here. This is what's in the Bible. But at some point, someone had to decide what books would go in there. And whenever you are thinking about this, and I'm going to assert that we got it right by having it in here, but there are a lot of questions that went into this originally. For example of the problem, remember we find out when you study in the New Testament, when you get to the Sadducees, remember they did not accept anything but the Torah. Okay, that's just the first 5 books, the Pentateuch. So there was actually a debate to some extent going on in their day based upon their sectarian group, that it hadn't been resolved exactly. So we can appreciate the problem. Now, the work of the scribes, though, who are mostly Pharisees during the intertestamental period, are the ones that pushed all this forward. So you say, why do we have these questions, though? It has to do a little bit with the unique aspect of the things you learn in Esther. Why would people not include it? Well, one of the reasons why is, if you've read through this book, is God's never mentioned. Did you notice that? God's never mentioned. So that caused some people to raise their eyebrows. How would you include a book and say that it was inspired by God when God's name doesn't even appear in it? That's one of the questions we need to answer. The New Testament does not quote from it. So you don't have a way, as you do with many books, to say, well, it's included because it's got the authority. Christ quotes from it, or Paul quotes from it, and so you know as they're using it by authority, okay, that's important. It's not just that they quoted by it, they used it as authority when they quoted. So we don't get that benefit. So you need some skepticism when you start off with. We've got a third problem. Esther is not found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not there. So you have to figure, okay, no, they didn't include it. Why not? Well, if we go back historically and we look and realize that from what we can tell, the Dead Sea Scrolls were the ones that operated that were the Essenes, and they would not have included that in their canon because they did not keep the Feast of Purim. So Esther, whatever their decision making was, they would not have had it through rejecting it for they decided it didn't belong, or that they had already decided they weren't going to keep that feast and so rejected the book. So you've got a lot of those kind of problems. So let's then talk though about why we would include it though. Josephus, who lived in the latter part of the 1st century AD, he stated that there were 22 Old Testament books. Now, all of you grew up and you were memorizing these numbers. 22 was not the number you memorized, was it? Okay, everyone from camp is excused from having to answer. But the rest of you people, I'm expecting participation. How many books are there in there? I'm going to go way back now, everyone. How many books are in the Old Testament? 39. Okay. Josephus says 22. Well, to understand when you see those is that it's actually his 22 are exactly our 39. Or at least we think they would be because of how they counted them. For example, the minor prophets were all counted as one book. Ezra and Nehemiah was together. Okay, and they would do that multiple times, and it would be divided up for a number of reasons. Okay, so the number of 22 for Josephus in the 1st century would have been accepting what we have as our 39 books today. And he, in his writing of Antiquities, includes Esther's story, and he kind of expands on it as he tended to do. So you have all those kind of things in mind. He also notes the time frame that ends with the reign of Artaxerxes, which is really important. That doesn't include, that is for the whole canon. That doesn't guarantee Esther's inclusion in that, but it does make a good case. The Jewish Mishnah included it, though some have challenged that due to its instituting a festival, which is what you find at the end of Esther. And the Midrash offers commentary on Esther. Now that's a later writing, that's commentaries, but that shows that by that time, say 2nd, 3rd century AD, that they accepted that as being canonical. So all of that's important. It was included as what we know as the writings. So there was this long debate about it, but it was always in the debate and more recognized as being inspired. The other thing, the last thing I'll say about that that's interesting when you go into these studies is there's this section that's found in the Apocrypha that are called the additions to Esther. Has anyone ever bothered to read the additions to Esther? Interesting. You're very strange people. I too have read the additions to Esther. When you compare what the additions to Esther were, and as that's writing, and what you find in Esther itself, in my opinion, you can easily understand why those additions were not included. I like to tell people that when you put the additions to Esther in, it makes it sound like a Disney movie because it highlights the princess story so much more. than what's actually done within Esther itself. Because we don't have Esther in the Dead Sea Scrolls means that as a Hebrew text, we only have it later in the Masoretic text, but it aligns pretty well. It's actually a more limited text, even than what we find in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation that was probably 2nd and 3rd century BC. There's another text in Greek that also had it, as well as what we find in Josephus. So you have a lot of evidence for it, though, and that's important, included as Scripture overall. All right, so all of that kind of, scholarly mumbo-jumbo stuff that people love. Now you get to the question, when you're writing, that's really hard when you deal with a lot of these books that are narrative, is who wrote it? Because we start off and we say, okay, Moses, we've got Moses for the first 5 books, right? We've got that. It becomes very difficult after that. Even if you recall, at the end of Deuteronomy, you've got the record of Moses' death. Well, I think a little common sense can tell us he didn't write about his own death. Okay, so that was put in likely by Joshua at the end. But so you're having to deal with all of those kind of things. I'm just going to suggest this. It doesn't matter. Once you've determined it's canonical, it doesn't matter as much. I would suggest, though, because of its association with Ezra and Nehemiah, that most likely Esther was penned by Ezra or someone associated with him. The time of when that writing would have been, because it's going to move, the date of the writing is going to have happened, not just right when it finished. Okay, we know essentially the date around when the events of Esther would have been done, okay, which is midway through the reign of Xerxes. Okay, so you're talking about in the 470s BC. But that the introduction of the book, if we read, now it came to pass in the days of, and I'm just going to read it, Xerxes, because no one knows how to pronounce this very well, and Xerxes is recognized, and I'll explain that more later. But because of that says that's been a while when this was written. It's not in the days of Xerxes we're writing, but in those days we have to have an explanation of what was happening. So I tend to put it actually later on of when it was actually penned, because also we tend to think that we have this assumption that there was inspired writing going on all the time, and that just wasn't true. Matter of fact, you really have 3 periods, main periods, of where a lot was written, and then it's sporadic after that. The main period, of course, is with Moses. The next period, it would have been around the time of David, and then the next period would have been at the time of Nehemiah and Ezra. And you can chart those both with the law, and especially when you look at the Psalms, you can see some of those distinctions. Now, a lot of people, you can know it had to have been after all these events, right? You couldn't have written that until they'd taken place. So it has to be after the 470s. Xerxes came to the throne in 486 BC with the death of his father Darius. And you have, then after that, and you say, well, how late could it have been? That's always the thing you'll get when you get into a commentary or a modernist, is they kind of push the date as late as they can. And to the point of, well, everyone wants to argue, they do it based upon language and everything, about, well, Greek, and it was written by Greeks, it's Hellenized. You don't really actually find that, I would argue, as much as they think. So it makes more sense for what I see then, if it's written at the same time and I would say by Ezra, then it would be around somewhere 420 BC, which was after the close at the end of Artaxerxes' reign, and right before is, of course, the close of the canon, which would have been around, we think, somewhere around between 420 and 400 with Malachi. And all of the other books had been written. So that's your time frame for it. It's also, one of the reasons why is the mixture of dating procedures fit actually very well within that time frame of how the dates are worked within this. So the next thing you have to consider when we go in and look at the book of Esther is the setting. So this is where all you people who love ancient history, all right. You're gonna. This is your stuff, okay? Because we're dealing with the Persian Empire. Now, you'll remember some about the Persian Empire because simply of reading about it within the context of Scripture. You will recall, for example, Cyrus, king of Persia. Right? And he was the one responsible, the exact date, probably around 538 BC, of when he would have come on the scene, at least as far as Judah was concerned. He was the one who was prophesied by Isaiah, okay, hundreds of years beforehand, that he'd be the one who would then release them from captivity. Isaiah prophesies that before they're in captivity. Going to be Cyrus. Now, the dynasty was established, and he goes back as far as specifically to his dad, but around not quite 20 years before that. And they start expanding. The Persians start expanding. And because they're able to expand, that's when they finally reach over and they're going into Babylon. That's when we find them on the scene, where they come into Babylon into Daniel 5, and they take Babylon. Well, this is Cyrus, king of Persia. Don't get confused because it has Darius as being king. He would have been placed there as kind of what we'd say was more of a governor figure. But in the role of the king of Babylon, they used to have a king, so they put someone called him a king there. That's who Daniel dealt with in Daniel 6, during the reign of Cyrus. Okay? So Cyrus is the one who then lets them all go back and makes the decree that we find in Ezra, the end of Chronicles, 2 Chronicles and Ezra, that they're allowed to return. And they go back. Now, we find, this is when you get into, I believe, Ezra 3, you see the crossover at 3 and 4. And it's there that we learn that sometime during Cyrus's reign, you had some kind of slowdown or a reason to stop. This is in Ezra 4. And so it had stopped. When you then, after that, you had Cambyses come on the throne, and that's when everything ground to a halt. Okay? And what you find with Ezra, when they're not able to build, and there's this halt to it, and then you have the prophets come on the scene. Haggai, why are you dwelling in these sealed houses? Not nice, you've taken care of your own house, and you've got the temples not been rebuilt. Then Zechariah comes on, and they come back after Zerubbabel had brought back originally and had the foundation of the temple. Now we're going to finish it. Okay? And so they started up when they had the opportunity. When Cambyses then goes off the throne, when he dies, there's a little bit of a power struggle and everything then. And that's when Darius then comes on the scene. And you have an opportunity. And you can see chapter 4 of Ezra is, you have to understand, it's its own kind of thing. Because it's detailing all the resistance over the whole period reflected in the book and before. So don't get thrown off by that. So right there in the middle here, now they get to go back. And so 520 to 516, they are working on the temple. They finished the temple in 516. Okay. Now, the other thing that's going to go on is, if you're going in ancient history, Darius is actually kind of important because while I said they were expanding, that's how you make money in the ancient world, right? You keep expanding, taking other people's stuff, right? But it's a government, so it's okay. So we go through, and we go and we expand. So he's expanding east, okay? And that's going to be ultimately, you're going to get to India. That's quite a ways. And then you're going to go west. Well, they expanded west until they ran into this small little people called the Greeks. And this is where you read about where the Greeks are fighting back. And the reason why I go into this with Darius is that toward the end of his reign, is the Greeks beat them. That's really their first time being beaten back. That they didn't get to keep expanding. And when you lose, the great thing is when you win battles, you take all the spoils. When you lose battles, you go home with your tail between your legs, and all it did was cost you a small fortune. Right? That comes to play when you get to Esther. Okay? So we find then that Darius is going to die in 486 BC, and that's what allows Xerxes to come to the throne. Now, Xerxes, that name you get, and you say, how do you get from Ahasuerus? There's a lot of different ways we could try to do that name we're reading it in English based upon the Hebrew taken from the Persian. But what we originally got his name from was from the Persian that was taken into the Greek by Herodotus. If you want to read about Xerxes, you need to read Herodotus' histories. He wrote a lot about Xerxes. He was an interesting guy. Okay, so you want background to what was going on when Esther was written, or not written, but occurred. Then you have actually a historical source, and you have to understand how ancient histories worked, though, and because they would, they're putting in, they're getting all sorts of conversations and stuff that they wouldn't have actually had access to, but you're filling in and getting the gist of everything. So that's how you need to read them. And it's a good storytelling of real things. So that's what you have when you get with Xerxes. But we got the name then from Herodotus, which is taking the Persian into the Greek first. So if you can compare it, what you really have is the problems of missing letters, Persian letters that don't match, that have trouble matching up with Greek letters, Persian letters that have trouble matching up with Hebrew letters, and then understanding that the sound, right? You say Xerxes when that's actually, right? You're going to have more of a sound. So you're going to have, that's where you get a hard H, right? So you have to think of these, for your benefit, it's like the world's rudest German. Okay? Just so you understand, it just sound like you're clearing your throat real hard. Okay, so that's kind of what you get. So you see some of the letters here, I just want you to understand that that's why we're just going to point out at Xerxes so that it aligns historically so you can appreciate that. Okay, so Darius had built a palace in Susa. That's Shushan. Okay, the difference in the letterings and deciding whether or not it's a s sound or a sh sound. Remember Sibboleth and Shibboleth? Okay, it actually in Hebrew is the same letter, and it depends on where they put a dot. Okay, so that's what you end up with this kind of situation, Susa and Shusha. Darius had built a palace there. That's one of the ways it's going to figure into this story. There's another palace. They had multiple palaces, though, based upon their history. You have Xerxes was building a palace that would be Persepolis, which is Persia's city, essentially. Okay? And so he's doing that, and we're also going to find another place that works into it that was an older place that was also available to them. So that's kind of the background. So you have this vast expanse of people. Okay, that had won successfully, been used to winning over the big empires around them. And this is ultimately what makes it possible. They're going to stay on the throne. This is the Achaemenid dynasty. They stay on that throne from Cyrus all the way down. So now you get down and you're talking about before the 530s. They stay on the throne essentially, and they're in charge in the dominant empire for over 200 years until Alexander the Great comes along. He is the one who ultimately defeats them, and that's why Alexander the Great was able to go all the way to India, is because Persia had paved the path. Once you beat Persia, it's a walk in the park, because you already own that territory essentially. Okay? And so we need to put that into context when we think all that was going on. Okay? So Jews of the intertestamental period, so that's the time between the close of inspiration and the canon until John the Baptist, really, who needed background on why do we have this Purim feast. That would be the first people that would need the information of this book. You have to always ask, why do we even need this? Why is this even included? Well, if you're going to have this feast, they had to have had an explanation of why are we doing this. And one of the things you find later on is they're going to read this account as part of the feast. So it was kind of, in that way, it's kind of like reading the Declaration of Independence on July 4th. Is that you're going to have this, only trust me, Esther's far more interesting as I read. Okay, Surya?
Connects everything else. It kind of brings everything.
It does connect. It connects in the similar way to what Ezra and Nehemiah connect. Now, but I'm glad you brought that up, because I'll go in now and talk about the larger picture of what we're dealing with. When you look at God's promises to his people, and you go all the way back, and you look specifically at Genesis 12, though Genesis 12, when he is making promise to Abraham there, and he promises, in thy seed all nations of the earth shall be blessed, that's a key, I hope you remember, quotation you will find multiple times in the New Testament. But he also promised them that not only the seed promise, but he promised Abraham that he would make a great people as the sand of the sea. That was in chapter 15 of Genesis. So there's a nation promise. And he promised Abraham that he would be giving him that land. That was the original thing that went with it. Remember when he called him out of Ur of the Chaldees? He goes up to Haran and then brings him through into Canaan. He never possessed that, as the writer of Hebrews points out. But that was what the promise was about. You had a seed promise, a nation promise, and a land promise. Well, all of that is what kind of works its way through the narrative of the Old Testament, and I would argue even the other books. So that when you get to what needs to be showing that God is true to his promises, and this is just one example, you have with Ezra coming back, now what do they have? It is they're back in their land. With Nehemiah, they are restored with the walls being built and everything back in place. They're now restored as a people. Esther is the book that is about the seed being preserved and God's action in preserving the seed. So when we learn to understand the larger picture of what was significant about all this, because God all along, it was all about the seed. The nation was the means, and the land, you have to put a nation in a land. That is then ultimately, as they come out of all of this, again, I would say consolidated and pointed in the Messiah. Why? Because he's the seed. And that's how you see everything in the Old Testament begin going back to Genesis 3, verse 15, and the promise of the seed that would overcome this problem. And now that's all is going to be spread out to get to Israel and the nation, and then come back down to being about the Messiah for what he is going to do. And then ultimately all of that is what we're going to find in Christ and the church. So that's part of what we see here for its purpose as a book. It's tying it over to say we wouldn't be here except for God's providence, even though it doesn't say God. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why. But that's what I think is key about as you go through this book. That is the center of the story is this, because that's the problem that has to be addressed. Now, when you have people who will come along and they'll look at this, it poses a number of problems for people as a book. So you remember when you have people proposing this, it goes all the way from, hyper-modernist type of thinking, that is just a book, cleverly written, to we don't want to look at it any way other than as, straight factual kind of things as far as approach. The approach of the book is definitely literary, and that's one of the differences. Some want to make it a fictional narrative. This is just a made-up story. Now, you say, why would people do that? Number one, they don't have a lot of faith in inspiration. That's part of the problem. But one of the other reasons why is it is written so well as a short story. And I'm going to try to illustrate that to you as we go through the book. That it is such high, outstanding literature that people discount the historical part of it. That's what's going on. So therefore, it's kind of a backhand compliment in a way. Some have thought, well, you had a Persian chronicle. It's not written like a Persian chronicle. It's a Greek romance. Well, it's interesting to have a Greek romance written about a Persian king and a Jewish queen. I don't know why the Greeks would do that and follow that. But of course, they're assuming it's a much later written. Some would call it a carnival tale. Or a festival. I learned this word, ideology. Now, all that means is it was something written to be read at a festival, which is the Feast of Purim. Well, it was. Okay. But you see, the problem is when you decide that if it falls into this category, this other thing about it can't be true. This is the problem with categories. What do you do when something falls into more than one category? See, that's the problem when scholars get together is they think their categories are king. Right. Thank you, Mr. Librarian, that you understand this. Right? Now, if people still had a card catalog system, they'd understand how that worked. Yes. Say it again. You cannot put inspiration in a box. Very good. Some have also want to call it a wisdom tale or a narratived lament. What does that even? This is sad that this happened, I guess. Some have even called it, it's a comedy. Well, it's a classical comedy in the sense that you end up with a positive ending. However, let's also recognize, and we're going to point out as we go through this book, there are some moments that are in this book that are absolutely hilarious if you appreciate irony. It has more irony in this book probably than any other book. And we're going to try to highlight that as we go through of what the author is doing and creating, because as something that was written both to teach a lesson about how this is happening and the nature of God's working, and that it's going to be something that is going to be intended to be read for years to come, it's really good at keeping you on the edge of your seat. If you're a Jew, you know that because of the form and because of the style, that the ending is good, because you exist, by the way. So it's one of those things where you know it's a good positive ending, but it's getting you there, and you've got all these literary elements to keep you there and excited about how this happened. It was beneficial for you. And so it is It's multiple things in a literary sense. It's serving multiple kind of roles as literature. But of course, it's more than literature. It is an inspired record that I would argue is inspired history written by someone who knew how to tell a story in the absolute best, most compelling way possible. And it is so densely packed in how it's put together that you end up with all this information. It's quick moving. You've got to go through things pretty quickly, and then you'll have a disruption. You're like, what's happening now? It's just good at suspense. It has, again, humor, organization. We're going to show you by the end of how powerful that is. And it is brought in by, when you're looking at any kind of literature, you have a third-person narrator, so it's written from an after-the-point person, but who has access, whether through it's clearly inspired that makes this possible, but they would have been telling this as they went, but it's this outside person. In other words, it's not Esther's not writing it, Mordecai's not writing it, the time. It's written after the fact, I said before, probably by someone like Ezra, to tell their story for the benefit of making sure that it's not forgotten. So in our remaining time, I want to look at the challenges and finish up with purpose, which we've already delved into just a touch. That is, why is this book still relevant then? If it was written originally for Jews about how they survived, then it's actually and that's not relevant for us, then it's actually for our benefit. The key element is how God took care to make sure the seed continued to accomplish his purpose. Now, there are other lessons you can learn from it that tell you about God, in that, what does that say he will do? He took care of that, then he will also take care of us. Broad, big picture kind of idea. It is a connector from one small scene of Jewish history, absolutely. But one of the things that I want to caution you against when we come to this book is the typical way in which sometimes we just approach narrative in general, and that we need to make sure we are a little, we pay attention to it and don't do just automatically. And that is, the general way in which most people read through something is we find either this is a good guy, this is a bad guy, or it is clear what they've done, and so we evaluate what they've done, and that's the moral lesson. And so we end up inserting moral lessons into the process as if that was the purpose of it being written. You always have to go back to the purpose of the writing and connect the lessons to the original purpose of the writing. Or else you can end up kind of pushing the limits of why it was even written. And the easiest way to understand what I'm talking about here will come up in chapter 1, and that is we're going to see Vashti, okay? And one of the things that I'll tell you makes Esther very hard to do sermons on, because the point of that is not about Vashti's modesty. Matter of fact, we don't even know exactly not ever given the exact reasons for it. We're going to go into that in more detail of her refusal. But we end up then taking our issues and finding a nice kind of story that fits and using it for our purposes, not the author's purposes. Okay? So we have to be careful about it. Doesn't mean that you can't discuss modesty from it, but you need to understand the limitations of doing that. The other thing is, was it just written, is it all about Esther, or is it all about Israel? And again, we come down to why is both not an option here? And the reason why I would argue for both is when you get to the end, there is a distinction that is made between what's going on in Susa and what's going on throughout the empire. and it is deliberately going back and forth, which tells you it's intentionally, it started that way as well. Something happening within the palace that extended throughout the empire, that ended up bringing Esther in, and then at the end, you are also seeing something that starts within there in Susa and that extends as well to the whole empire. So it is deliberately dealing with the two, both of them, because they're related, and he's pulling them together in as a kind of as a unit. It's one of the things to look for. So when we look through this, and we will we'll start into some more literary things next week. And y'all will have to bear with me on that because you'll think how's this helping with Scripture? I hope it'll actually help you a lot with Scripture. When you go through Esther, though, you should notice how it's put together, and it is everything. The big element in a literary fashion you're going to see is mentioned actually in Esther 9. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. That idea of opposites, and that is what is in a literary fashion known as a reversal, is the key to understanding how this book is written. It is about taking things one way and all of a sudden we're going to flip them. And that's how the story comes together. We're going to look at other things that have to do with the nature of literature as we're going to evaluate it next week. I don't know how long that'll take us. That may depend upon your contributions to class and answers. But hopefully after that, we'll be able to get into the text, and I'll show you how this applies in studying Old Testament narrative. Thank you for your attention.